So here we come to the crucial question of Nagel's essay, or the crucial argument regarding the crucial question. And this is the argument that Nagel makes, again, to try to establish that death can be said, in some cases, not all, perhaps, but at least in some cases, to be a bad thing for the person who dies, which would be ridiculous to Epicurus, but that's what Nagel wants to prove. Well, the key, I think, is to sort of expand the matter beyond death and to think of the philosophical question at stake as one about the conditions under which we would say that anything bad had happened to someone. And the crucial question is it a necessary condition to say that is to say that something bad has happened to someone, that they experience some kind of bad state. That if they're not hurt in any sort of conscious way by something, can we still say that something bad has happened to them? What Nagel really wants to prove is that we certainly can. That is, for someone to actually experience some kind of negative state in order to say that something bad had happened to them would be unduly restrictive. Take a look here, a crucial part, page 76, second paragraph. It should be recognized that if these are valid objections to counting death as an evil, they will apply to many other supposed evils as well. The first type of objection is expressed in general form by the common remark that what you don't know can't hurt you. Now, okay, that's something we can grab onto. It's a familiar phrase, but just remember that Nagel is arguing against that. That is, he is arguing that what you don't know can hurt you. So, yes, but that position, that what you don't know can't hurt you, he said, would entail the rest of it. It means that even if a man is betrayed by his friends, ridiculed behind his back, and despised by people who treat him politely to his face, none of it can be counted as a misfortune for him, so long as he does not suffer as a result. Okay, that's the key, right? Means that a man is not injured if his wishes are ignored by the executor of his will, or if, after his death, the belief becomes current that all the literary works on which his fame rests were really written by his brother, who died in Mexico at the age of 28. It seems to me worth asking what assumptions about good and evil lead to these drastic restrictions. Again, Nagel arguing that, let's say that we have a famous author who is now deceased, and erroneously it becomes widely believed that all of his literary works are really written by someone else. Would that count as an injury against the author? Nagel is saying certainly would. The author's dead. He can't be, he's not going to be conscious of the injury. He's certainly not going to feel anything as a result of the injury, but he wants to say, Nagel wants to say that still it would be an injury. And this is where you have to think. This is really the interesting question, whether that makes sense. Right? Also, things like betrayals, say that someone's spouse is betraying them, and he or she never becomes aware of it. Has that person been injured? If they don't become aware of the betrayal and they don't suffer as a result, have they been injured? It's a great question. Nagel wants to argue that indeed they have been injured, and misfortune has happened to them. A bad thing has happened to them. And he says all these questions have something to do with time. There certainly are goods and evils of a simple kind, including some pleasures and pains, which a person possesses at a given time simply in virtue of his condition at that time, like having a headache or grieving. Those are bad conditions. Those are evils that you possess at a given time simply in virtue of your condition at that time. But again, that's not the only category of bad things. He says, but this is not true of all the things we regard as good or bad for a man. Often we need to know his history to tell whether something is a misfortune or not. That is, you need to know somebody's biography. You need to put it in context. This applies to ills like deterioration, deprivation, and damage. Sometimes his experiential state is relatively unimportant, as in the case of a man who wastes his life in the cheerful pursuit of a method of communicating with asparagus plants. Like, that person may be happy, Nagel seems to be saying, but they're wasting their lives. So even though their experiential state is one of cheerfulness, it's not a good for them. It's a bad for them. Again, this is something you have to think about, right? Whether that is plausible to you. Someone who holds that all goods and evils must be temporally assignable states of the person. That is, if we say that when a bad thing has happened to somebody, that we have to be able to assign it a certain place and time, may, of course, try to bring difficult cases into line by pointing to the pleasure or pain that more complicated goods and evils cause. Loss, betrayal, deception, and ridicule are, on this view, bad because people suffer when they learn of them. Right? So say that a friend betrays you. How are you hurt or are you injured when the friend betrays you, or are you injured when you find out and feel bad about the friend betraying you? So that if you never find out and feel bad because of it, you were never hurt. That's what he's sort of questioning and arguing that that's not plausible, right? But it should be asked how our ideas of human value would have to be constituted to accommodate these cases directly instead. This would enable us to explain why their discovery causes suffering. One possible account is that most good and evil fortune has as its subject a person identified by his history and his possibilities, rather than merely by his categorical state of the moment. And that while this subject can be exactly located in a sequence of places and times, the same is not necessarily true of the goods and ills that befall him. And here comes his most powerful example. What follows on page 77, the person has a devastating brain injury, reduce him to the state of a contented infant, psychologically to the state of a contented infant. Let's say that somebody is a perfectly functioning adult, has a, let's say, painless brain injury that reduces them instantaneously to the psychological condition of a contented infant, so that psychologically speaking or mentally speaking, their mental state is no different from that of an actual infant who's contented or happy. Did a bad thing happen to that person? Now remember, they've never actually experienced any kind of suffering. They've experienced a loss of all their adult faculties, but they're not aware of that loss, so they don't feel bad about it. Psychologically, they're identical to a happy, contented infant. Did something bad happen to them? Well, Nagel's strategy is to say, well, we all know that something bad happened to them. That is, that there's no question that if a normally functioning adult is reduced to the psychological state of a contented infant, that's a tragedy that's happened to that person, not to the world, not to others who may miss the person or even pity them, but for the person now who is unaware of their loss. And you can see immediately he reveals why he uses this hypothetical, this example, because it has very close relevance to the question of whether we can regard death as a misfortune. The view that such a man has suffered a misfortune is open to the same objections which have been raised in regard to death. He does not mind his condition, just as the dead don't mind being dead. It is, in fact, the same condition he was in at the age of 3 months, except that he is bigger. So you can see the strategy here. The man who suffered the devastating brain injury has undergone a loss of which he is unaware and is not suffering because of. The dead, Nagel would say, have undergone a loss, and the loss is all the goods of life that they would have experienced had they not died. And they're not aware of the loss because the dead don't exist at all under this hypothesis, the Epicurean hypothesis. So if we can admit that despite his blissful unawareness of his loss, that the man who's experienced the brain injury has something bad has happened to him, then we should be able to admit that although the dead are not aware of the loss of life, loss of the goods of life, and are certainly not suffering as a result of death, that we can still say that something bad has happened to them, because it is not a necessary condition